We come together on this, the 400-year anniversary of the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock and their first encounter with the Wampanoag people. At the church that I grew up in, we used to pray this way. Please pray with me in this moment. Dear Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable unto you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When I was a kid, public schools all over America had us dress up as Pilgrims and Indians during the Thanksgiving holidays. We put on ridiculous black triangular hats, or we put on fake Native American headdresses so we could tell the story of local Native tribes welcoming the white pilgrims to their land and saving them from a harsh winter. As far as we were taught, there were celebrations of food and friendship, and everyone was happy and thankful, and the end. It's been a nice sermon, and that's the end. It's a happy ending. There is, in fact, an adorable photo of me in first grade with a headband and Indian feathers, so-called Indian feathers, and face paint on my cheek. Indian was a costume of a people from the past who didn't exist anymore. That is what I thought. How exactly those people vanished from the earth, I did not know. Their existence, like that of the Pilgrims, was part of myth and legend. Scholars are in total disagreement on how many people lived in the Americas before Columbus arrived. Most scholars 100 years ago believed there were less than 10 million people in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus. Most scholars today believe the number is anywhere between 50 and 100 million people. But we know that today there are 5 million left in the United States. And the story of how the native population fell by at least 90% over the last 500 years is a story of broken treaties, war, imperial conquest, weaponized disease, and atrocities the likes of which I shudder to repeat. It is a grim history. Thanksgiving today falls into the same category of many American holidays. With Christmas, the question is, what on earth does the birth of Jesus have to do with cutting down millions of pine trees and putting them in the living room for 3 weeks and then throwing them away? What on earth does the birth of Jesus has to do with shopping sprees at Target and Walmart and Amazon? But I'll save that one for a Christmas sermon. With Thanksgiving, the question is, how do I understand this seemingly benign holiday where my friends and family gather and eat a giant dinner together and somehow put that holiday side by side with this quasi-mythical Pilgrims and Indians story, which completely glosses over centuries of genocide and terror that the colonists and later the American Empire committed against those people? How can I eat turkey and give thanks with the backdrop of a story like that, which more than anything else is more similar to being a Holocaust story? What on earth am I celebrating? What on earth am I thankful for, and why? A Native American colleague of mine named Isabel Azizi taught me that Thanksgiving is a day of mourning in her culture. And so I asked myself, how is it that my family and I are sharing stories of what we're thankful for on the same day that she and her family are in mourning? What am I going to do with this? How do I hold all of this in my mind at the same time? What is the answer? Should we cancel Thanksgiving? I want to turn to the words of Deuteronomy that we read earlier this morning. The Old Testament prophet says, God is about to bring you into a good land, a land with brooks and rivers, springs and lakes, streams out of the hills and through the valleys. It's a land of wheat and barley, vine and figs and pomegranates, olive oil and honey. It's a land where you'll never go hungry, always food on the table and a roof over your head. Thank your God for the good land he has given to you now. Of course, my first question is, now hold on a second. God gave who this land? Because in an American context, there were already people here when the Pilgrims arrived. And this is completely leaving my father's ancestors out of the picture. By the time 2 generations had gone by at Plymouth, there were already African slaves living at that colony. Well, didn't God give the Africans their own land too? So whose land is God giving to whom? Who is being promised this land? Well, let's see what the prophet has to tell us. In the book of Deuteronomy, it continues, but remember the Lord your God, the God who delivered you from Egyptian slavery, the God who led you through that huge and fearsome wilderness, those desolate, arid badlands, crawling with fiery snakes and scorpions, the God who gave you water gushing from the heart of rock, the God who gave you manna to eat in the wilderness. If you start thinking to yourself, I did this all by myself, I'm rich and it's all mine, well, think again. Remember that God, your God, gave you the strength to produce all of this wealth so as to confirm the covenant. And now, my dear friends, we have arrived somewhere. This land of milk and honey that we live in, this land of abundance and food and having a roof over our heads. This land which, yes, is also the spoils of war. It's also generations of wealth built on the back of enslaved people. This land is given to us as part of a covenant. Now, what is a covenant? I'm not a scholar on these issues, but Hebrew scholars will tell you there are at least 2 Hebrew words that translate into covenant in the Bible, one of which derives from a Hebrew word that means cutting. And in an ancient ritual, 2 parties who were entering a legal agreement would sacrifice an animal, cut the flesh, and then pass together between the pieces of flesh that had been cut to signify the severity of their agreement. So, if all of this abundance that we have, some of which we earned with our own hard work, but very much of it we did not earn, if this is given to us as part of a covenant by God, then my next question is very simple. What does the Lord require of you? What is God asking for us to do with these riches, with this bounty, with this abundance? The prophet Micah chapter 6, verse 8, if you know it, say it with me. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Justice, mercy, humility. In the Deuteronomy passage about this land we are promised by God, the prophet gives us this land and with an expectation that we follow these commandments. Now, in a Christian context, what does that mean? If only there was a passage from the New Testament we could rely on. If only Jesus told us which commandments were the most important to follow. And I know you are already with me. The elder asks Jesus, which is the most important commandment? And what does Jesus say? Love thy God with all thy heart and thy mind and thy strength. And there is another just like it. Love thy neighbor as thyself. But in the Gospel of Luke, the scholar tries to get cute with it. And the scholar says, oh yeah, I love my neighbor as myself. Well then, who's my neighbor? And what does Jesus say? The Samaritan, the enemy of the Jews, the Gentile, the one we are culturally taught to hate, the one who we are culturally taught to push aside, the ones who don't share the same beliefs as us, the ones who do not look like us. Jesus says, let me show you what neighborliness looks like. Let me tell you about what being a neighbor looks like. It looks like a person you would otherwise hate is left bleeding on the side of the road. And what do? You do not walk by. You lift him up. You heal their wounds. You pay for her stay at the inn. You see to their housing. Service to others. Not because they deserve it, but because serving others is the way we live out this covenant. our agreement with God. Before the Last Supper, what is Jesus doing? Washing the feet of his disciples, service to others. The prophet Micah teaches us justice, mercy, humility. And centuries later, the prophet Jesus tells us service to others, being willing to lay down your life to serve others. So, what do we do, my dear friends, about Thanksgiving? Well, here's my first suggestion. Let's say goodbye to the fantasy. Let us put this old apocryphal story to rest. 97% of Americans are not descended from the Pilgrims, who were European anyways, and not Americans as we think of it. Some of them, yes, escaping religious persecution, some of them political exiles, some of them searching for fame and fortune, and some of them preparing to trade human beings for profit. Can we be done with the Pilgrims, please? What is this attachment to them? Maybe we just like the hats and the belt buckles. I'm not sure. What is our attachment to the Pilgrims, especially when we know that the story ends with broken treaties and blankets intentionally infected with smallpox? Are we ready to let this story go? For many Native peoples, this is a time of mourning the loss of their ancestors because those early settlers eventually became the empire that laid waste to so many of the Native peoples. So why are we dragging the Wampanoag ancestors into our fantasy world where everyone hung out and had a feast and everyone was happy and the end? Because, oh, by the way, let's not talk about what happened next. Let's leave out the part about human catastrophe. What are we doing? Let's come into this present time and let the bones of those ancestors be laid to rest. We do them no honor by parading this fantasy world out in the middle of our culture every year. Sure, it's a warm, fuzzy story. I like big meals. A story about people who are different getting together and having a big celebration is a very nice idea. But how do we square this with the idea of the rest of the story and giving thanks? Thanksgiving. I'm not thankful for smallpox blankets and broken treaties. I'm not willing to tell a Pilgrims and Indians story that leaves that part out because that would be dishonest. So what do we do instead? All of these gifts, all of this abundance given to us by God, but so much of it, intentionally or not, are the spoils of war, slavery, greed. So what do we do with these gifts? The prophet Micah, do justice, love mercy. The prophet Jesus, serve others, heal the sick, free the captives, feed and house the poor. Loving our neighbors is not some kind of passive show of affection. It's not an intellectual or theological exercise. It is healing the sick. It is feeding the hungry. It is active. It is alive. It is what the Greeks called agape love. What Martin Luther King tells us in his 1958 essay, An Experiment in Love. He says, agape love springs from the needs of the people. Agape is not a passive love. It is an active love. It is a willingness to go any length to restore community, what Malcolm X described as by any means necessary, lifting up wounded and oppressed people just like the Samaritan did back in the book of Luke. So pick a social action this week. Show God how thankful you are by giving something away. About 3 years ago, an indigenous leader named Karina Gould taught me about the Shuumi land tax, which is a voluntary tax given to the local Ohlone people who are the rightful owners of the land that I live on. So I come before you this morning with humility, because I have owned a home now for over 2 years and have not yet paid this tax to the Ohlone people. Like Jonah, I have ignored God's call. So I will fix that this week because this is not my land. My mother's ancestors immigrated here from Europe, and my father's ancestors were brought to this continent in chains. I didn't expect I'd be putting a testimony in here at the end of my sermon, but here it is. This is what God is asking of me for Thanksgiving. Too much of my money is sitting in the bank, and not enough of it is in the hands of local nonprofit organizations or saving lives in my community. Not enough of my money has gone to local business owners who are the lifeblood of my community. Too much of my money is in the bank. Not much of it has gone to the Ohlone tribe. And I'm going to change that. That is my commitment on Thanksgiving in the year 2020. Yes, we are in the middle of a pandemic. Coronavirus has taken so much away from us. Many of us are mourning, spending Thanksgiving alone, without family, without that big, beautiful meal. But despite it all, we are still so blessed, so much abundance, food, housing, clothes, internet access, bank accounts, cars. Let us transform Thanksgiving into a day of justice. Let us transform Thanksgiving into a day of agape love. That doesn't just mean sitting around the table with our family and friends. It means being active in the community and transforming lives and lifting up the oppressed and lifting up the poor. Let us transform the fantasy of Pilgrims and Indians from the past into a dream and a strategy for a future of racial and economic justice in America for all. Let's use Thanksgiving to leverage our resources, both earned and unearned, for the betterment of other people. Let us transform giving thanks into giving help. Let us transform feeding ourselves into feeding others, giving thanks into giving help. Let us be the living embodiment of the agape love that Jesus is talking about, that Martin Luther King is talking about. Let us be better and look at Thanksgiving in the context of how we can change the world, acknowledging the gifts we have, transforming that gratitude into service of others. The songwriter Ruth Duck put it this way: we cannot own the sunlit sky, the moon and the wildflowers growing, for we are part of all that is within life's river flowing. With open hands receive and share the gifts of God's creation, that all may have abundant life in every earthly nation. When bodies shiver in the night and weary wait for morning, when children have not bread but tears and war horns sound their warning, God calls humanity to awake, to join in a common labor, that all may have abundant life and oneness with their neighbor. Amen.